4, 3.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Ludi, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Northern Animals and Borders virtual workshop. I'm a postdoc at the University of Toronto, and along with Glenn Eyston and Heather Green, I'm one of the conveners of this workshop. While we're meeting on a virtual platform, I would like to begin the event by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands we are each on today. I'm joining you from Corner Brook on the west coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, and I acknowledge that the land on which I am currently situated is in traditional Mi'kmaq territory. And I would also like to acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, and the Inuit of this province. I'd also like to say a special thank you to the participants who've joined us today and who will be speaking about their research on the histories of animal-human relationships in the Arctic. A big thank you to Sean Kheraj and the team at NiCHE for supporting this initiative and for helping us to bring the Northern Animals and Borders workshop to this virtual platform after many, many changes and sadly having to give up an in-person workshop in the Yukon. But we're happy that you are able to join us today, and as well to the audience for taking time from your busy schedule and amidst many other opportunities for other virtual events. So thank you all for joining us. Now I'd like to pass it over to Glenn Eyston, who's speaking today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Secwepemc, Chilcotin, and Southern Dakek.
Thank you very much, John. And I'd like to thank everybody for who's joining us for the inaugural David Neufeld Memorial Lecture. I'm sure many people here watching this are already familiar with David Neufeld, but I will give a bit of an introduction here. So as a historian, David Neufeld has championed many things, including Northern history, public history, Indigenous history, and heritage. He spent his career as a Parks Canada historian and learning from the people on the land of the Yukon Territory, pushing for inclusion and two-eyed seeing, and mentoring many young and early career researchers who shared his passions. The passing of David in late 2020 brought to light just how many people, both within and outside of the academic world, he had influenced, supported, and mentored throughout his life. Many people, both in the academic world and in the Yukon heritage community, have countless stories of David's generosity. And I'm sure there are many people watching today who have kind of countless stories, countless and wonderful stories of David and his enthusiasm and his generosity, and of his many contributions towards Northern history and Northern heritage. And it just kind of goes to show just how many lives he touched. And so in order to honor David's legacy, the David Neufeld Memorial Lecture is going to take place annually in a virtually streamed format, and will feature the work of early career researchers, public historians, and Indigenous historians and heritage workers. And so this year, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Rebecca Woods, whose lecture is entitled Temporal Transgressors, Frozen Mammoths, Climate Change, and the Politics of Deep Time. Dr. Rebecca Woods is a historian of science and environment, specializing in the history of animals in the 19th century. She is jointly appointed to the Department of History and the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. Her first book, The Herds Shot Round the World, Native Breeds and the British Empire from 1800 to 1900, which was published with the University of North Carolina Press in 2017, explored the transformation of sheep, cattle, and colonial environments in Great Britain, New Zealand, and North America. Her most recent article on techniques and technologies for the preservation of meat in Victorian Britain came out in Osiris in 2020. What's his current research focus focuses on the role of frozen mammoth on frozen mammoth bodies in the formation of paleontological and paleoecological knowledge since 1800. She had received her PhD in 2013 from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Columbia University Society of Fellows in the Humanities from 2013 until 2016. And in 2018, she was a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. What's this work has been supported by the Fulbright Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Social Sciences Research Council, the American Council of Learned Societies, and most recently, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And so we're very excited to welcome Rebecca Woods, and we're excited for her presentation here. And before I pass things on to Dr. Woods here, I would also like to let you know that within the chat function of YouTube, you can post any questions that you might have, and we'll have a short question and answer period afterwards. And so with that, I will pass things over to Rebecca Woods.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks very much for that really kind introduction. Let's see. So thanks for that very kind introduction, Glenn. And my sincere thanks to the organizers of this workshop, to Glenn, Heather Green, Jonathan Ludi, and to Karen Routledge, as well as the other members of the workshop. I'm really excited to be here and to have the opportunity to share my work. I'd also like to thank Sean Kheraj and NiCHE for making the virtual event we're participating in possible. I'm really honored to be giving the inaugural David Neufeld Memorial Lecture. So we're all tuning in today from our respective homes and locales, but as a faculty member at the University of Toronto, I'm speaking to you from my home in Toronto, where I'm fortunate to dwell. As is customary for members of the U of T community when beginning any kind of public event, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in this community and on this land. Okay, so woolly mammoths, the star of today's talk and the icon of the Pleistocene, the last glacial period that lasted from about 110,000 years ago until about 12,000 years ago. We're all familiar with the creature, and probably most of us, if not all of us, know that the species MAMMOTH primigenius went extinct about 11,000 years ago. The last subspecies of dwarf mammoths only went extinct about 4,000 years ago. It might seem obvious then that the political boundaries of the last several centuries that constitute a focus of today's workshop are largely irrelevant to woolly mammoths. And that may indeed be the case. I think we can safely assume that to a mammoth like Dima, who died about 40,000 years before the present, and who was exhumed in 1978, whether the Homo sapiens who dug him up were American, Canadian, or more likely Russian or Soviet, makes very little difference. Yet the context into which such specimens were brought dramatically shaped and shapes how they were and are understood. This is the case not only for political boundaries, but for temporal ones as well. Time's boundaries, how we splice past, present, and future, are subject to contestation, no less so than their spatial counterparts. Frozen mammoths, unearthed from the circumpolar permafrost, primarily in Siberia, but in a much more limited way from Alaska and the Yukon as well, often replete with their fat, muscle fiber, hair, are despite the passage of time. And they disturb our efforts to sort the past from the present, to sort one kind or one part of the past from another, and even sometimes to sort the future from the present. Crossing time's boundaries, they prompt us to consider how these creatures, emissaries from the past, possible guides into the future, help specialists and the public construct and conceptualize time itself. Over the last 2 centuries, as human presence and activity in the north increases, and as permafrost melts due to climate change, the meaning of these creatures has changed dramatically. From the most elusive of scientific specimens, only one frozen mammoth was successfully collected in the 19th century. Frozen mammoths and their Pleistocene contemporaries now emerge seasonally from softening permafrost and have become bellwethers for a warming planet. Their potential to tell time has similarly evolved. Whereas the first frozen mammoths were enrolled into debates over the geological past of the planet, the stakes of contemporary finds play out according to our contested era of the human and its possible futures. Once indicia of the Earth's hidden history, frozen mammoths have come to signify not only the consequences of anthropogenic climate change, but for some observers, the possibilities of transcending time itself through the interconnected projects of de-extinction and paleoecological restoration of entire lost landscapes. In this talk, I'll trace the arc of this evolution over the last 220 years by reflecting on frozen mammoths and other Pleistocene creatures as time travelers who help us to understand our relationship to time and its passage, and whose ability to do so has evolved over the centuries. 19th century frozen mammoths shed light on how naturalists conceptualized and even conjured the very notion of deep time, while mid-20th century mammoths present an opportunity to reflect on a turning point in our current understanding of past and present, that is, the Anthropocene. And finally, contemporary 21st century creatures are fodder for futuristic imaginings of new times in which extinction and climate change, rather than looming over the present and near future, can be transcended through the figure of the resurrected woolly mammoth. So let's begin at a beginning with the Adams mammoth, the first such creature to be successfully recovered from the frozen ground of Siberia in 1806, and so transformed into a natural history specimen. Like others that would come after it, the Adams mammoth was quote unquote discovered not once, but twice. First by a Tungus herder named Osip Shumakov, and then 7 years later by the Russian naturalist Mikhail Adams, for whom the animal is still known. Shumakov first espied the mammoth's feet sticking out of the banks of the Lena River, where it meets the Arctic Ocean in the year 1799. By the summer of 1804, it had melted out enough for him to obtain its tusks, which were his priority. Then, as now, mammoth ivory was a lucrative article of commerce. He brought the tusks to Yakutsk, where he exchanged them for merchandise reportedly worth 50 rubles. Adams, who was an adjunct to the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences, arrived in Yakutsk several years later and was told of Shumakov's find, described to him as an extraordinarily large animal with its skin, hair, and flesh preserved. At the time, although elephant-like bones and tusks were well known throughout Europe, and accounts of fleshy remains of mysterious creatures circulated, no soft tissue remains had been successfully collected by European naturalists. So Adams hurried about 1,300 kilometers up the Lena River, eager to collect, if he could, the mammoth's remains. But by the time he arrived, what was left of the mammoth had been, in his words, completely mutilated, much of its carcass consumed by local dogs and scavenging animals. Nevertheless, Adams oversaw the collection of most of the still articulated skeleton, 40 pounds of hair, an eye, and about 3/4 of its skin, and he sent it all back to St. Petersburg, where the skeleton was mounted and displayed. He then dashed off an account published in 1807 of his remarkable discovery, news of which traveled quickly. By 1812, the eminent French naturalist Georges Cuvier was wielding the story of this remarkable mammoth carcass, particularly its woolliness, in support of his twin theories of extinction and geological catastrophism. The mammoth, which radiocarbon dating establishes is about 38,000 years old, had arrived in a present moment in which the very nature of time on the planet was up for grabs. Naturalists on both sides of the Atlantic were embroiled in debates over the nature of speciation and of geological change. Were species fixed? Could they change in response to their environments? Could they go extinct? How old was the Earth? How much, how drastically, and how, that is by what mechanism, had the Earth changed over time? Elephants, and what we now consider their evolutionary relations, such as mammoths and mastodons, figured prominently in how these questions were posed. Experience and observation taught that elephants were tropical creatures, unsuited to the cold climes of the Northern Hemisphere. So how to explain the elephantine remains scattered throughout North America, Europe, Scandinavia, and Siberia, decidedly non-tropical places where no elephants roamed in the present? Were these bones the flotsam and jetsam of a biblical flood, washed north and then beached as the waters receded? Were they the remains of Hannibal's elephants, famously marched north into battle during antiquity? Or perhaps they were an indication that in some time past, the northern reaches of the globe had been warm and tropical. Cuvier was a firm believer in extinction, in the fixity of species, and in catastrophism, the latter being the notion that the earth changed as a result of sudden, transformative, even revolutionary shocks, rather than by the accrual of gradual and nearly imperceptible shifts over eons and eons, which was then the dominant view of geological change and was one that held until the late 20th century. The mammoth seemed to Cuvier to support his own positions, and he held it up in triumph as proof of three interrelated facts about the Earth's past and the way that it and life on it did or did not change over time. So Cuvier had had the opportunity to examine the mammoth's hair, several strands of which had made their way to a colleague in Paris. With the description of the animal's thick hide and coarse wool furnished in Adams's published account, Cuvier declared that unlike living elephants, mammoths were in fact woolly. The creatures whose bones littered the ground of Northern Europe and Siberia were therefore a distinct species. That's fact number one. Moreover, the mammoth's bodily remains also suggested that the Arctic was cold in the past, fact two, as it was at the time at which Cuvier wrote. Otherwise, he reasoned, why would the mammoth have a woolly coat? He thereby refuted claims that historical climate change could account for the presence of elephant bones in the far north. And then finally, he argued that the very nature of the mammoth's extraordinary preservation with intact flesh, skin, and other tissues supported his theory of catastrophism, fact number three. Only such a sudden catastrophe, he held, could account for the nearly perfect condition of the mammoth's corpse after so many thousands of years of interment. By his reasoning, the individual calamity of the Adams mammoth's death and its subsequent preservation across time mirrored in microcosm a geological catastrophe more massive in scale. Many historians of science have shown how the making of deep time was an ongoing, contested process throughout the 19th century, and Cuvier's arguments were by no means the last word on the matter. But the Adams mammoth was clearly pivotal in these debates. Having time traveled, as it were, from 35,000 years ago into the present of the 18 teens, its future, our past, this extraordinary specimen played a singular role in scientific controversies over the deep time history of the planet. And the Adams mammoth remained singular for nearly a century. Despite a handful of reported sightings of similarly preserved creatures in Siberia, only a few fragments of Pleistocene-era flesh were collected before 1902, when naturalists for what was by then the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences unearthed the Beresovka mammoth, a spectacularly well-preserved young male. Experts were able to surmise, based on the position in which he was found and the nature of the injuries he had sustained peri-mortem, that he had died after falling into a crevasse. Indeed, so perfectly was the Beresovka mammoth preserved that time seemed to have stood still since the moment of his death. His last meal remained in his stomach. Like an Ice Age version of the cracked face of a wristwatch telling the hour of death in an Agatha Christie mystery, his last bite of vegetation remained preserved between his teeth. Aided by the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which expedited both the arrival of collectors and the transport of the mammoth's remains, unprecedented quantities of the mammoth's corpse, including its organs, tissue, fat, and blood, as well as the skin, hide, hair, and skeleton, were subjected to scientific analysis. And the mammoth's actual skin was used to mount it in St. Petersburg, with those specimens hunted specifically for display. From their seats in the most prominent natural history institutions on the continent, American naturalists looked upon the well-publicized Beresovka mammoth with envy. Despite the great abundance of mammoth and mastodon remains found throughout North America, despite their significance, the significance of early American skeletal reconstructions for transatlantic post-Enlightenment science, like Charles Wilson Peale's mastodon, the famous painting of the excavation of which you see here. Despite the popularity of ersatz reconstructions later in the century, like Ward's famous Mammoth, and as Paul Semonin and others have argued, despite the significance of extinct proboscidea to American scientific nationalism, these specimens remained exceedingly rare in the early 20th century, eluding emissaries of the US National Museum, part of the Smithsonian, and the American Museum of Natural History, the AMNH, for decades. American institutions eagerly sought their own counterparts to the Beresovka mammoth in Alaska. Such a specimen as W.D. Matthews, a curator at the American Museum of Natural History, enthused in 1907, would be worth whatever it cost and would be, I think, the most valuable single addition we can make to our hall for exhibition and educational purposes, not even accepting, he clarified, the museum's two most spectacular displays, the Warren Mastodon or the Brontosaurus. Despite pursuing reports of mammoth carcasses encased in Alaskan ice, neither the Smithsonian nor the AMNH were able to obtain more than a small lump of fat in the case of the US National Museum, part of the Smithsonian, which was collected in 1896, and several straggly chunks of skin and hair collected for the AMNH in 1908. In the 19th and 20th centuries, searching for frozen mammoths was more or less an artisanal practice. Connections to elite institutions like the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Smithsonian, or the AMNH did little to increase the likelihood of finding and successfully collecting frozen Pleistocene remains. All collectors relied on local people, who were very often indigenous, to report sightings. Though such reports were more frequent in Siberia before the 20th century, Russian collectors rarely arrived in time to preserve the fragile remains of frozen mammoths, the primary exception before the 20th century being the Adams mammoth. And reports of frozen mammoths to be had in Alaska often deployed indigenous testimony as a mark of authenticity, a form of tacit, rhetorical, if not formal recognition of the extent to which newcomers at the time relied on indigenous Alaskans for valuable knowledge of the territory, the landscape, its contours, and its contents. And though such reports raised the hopes of museum administrators, American institutions were repeatedly disappointed. Having pursued one such account of a quote unquote, a quote, complete animal, including flesh and hair, only to find a skull and tusks, in 1907, the head of the US National Museum declared himself not further disposed to place confidence in any of these stories. For Americans in particular, the story of circumpolar frozen mammoth hunting remained a story of frustration until the mid-20th century. Beginning in the 1930s, though, the way in which the AMNH in particular prospected for paleontological specimens underwent a set of important changes that in 1948 produced Effie, the first and to date the only major frozen mammoth collected from the North American Arctic. Lucas Riopel has documented the close connections between resource mining and paleontology in the 19th century and early 20th century, showing how dinosaur bones were a valuable sideline of the mining industry. Similarly, the Yukon gold rush of the 1890s produced a bump in bony fossils from the Pleistocene era. And while paleontological collecting had long been symbiotic with mining, in the 1930s, a pair of developments, one industrial and one institutional, helped to realize American dreams of an Alaskan frozen mammoth. So first, for the industrial development, that was strip mining, which used hydraulic equipment to, quote, systematically expose acres and acres of surface composed of a stratum of muck, end quote, that was then thawed and washed away in order to give miners access to gold-bearing gravel positioned beneath it. Developed during the California gold rushes of the mid-19th century, by the 1920s, gold miners in Alaska were using hydraulic techniques. As well as gold, strip mining exposed the fossilized remains of Pleistocene fauna in unprecedented numbers. And now for the institutional development. Mediated by the University of Alaska and the wealthy independent paleontologist Childs Frick, whose private laboratory was connected to the museum, the AMNH entered into an agreement with the Fairbanks Exploration Company, a subsidiary of the US Smelting, Refining, and Mining Co., in which the latter, Fairbanks Exploration, would, quote, single out and salvage desirable material, end quote, for the museum as it laid bare huge swaths of Alaskan territory in the vicinity of Fairbanks. Boosters for the museum celebrated these efforts as an opening of the quote unquote vast icebox of nature. The FEC's hearty cooperation, in the words of one curator, paid dividends to the museum in the form of plentiful tusks, bones, and then in August 1948, the front half of a baby mammoth, who would eventually come to be known as Effie. The rest of its remains, including its bones, brains, and back half, were presumed lost to the ravages of the high-powered hoses used to strip the landscape. But even these partial remains were a major coup for the museum. Effie was embalmed locally before flying Air Express back to New York, where it was temporarily displayed in what was described as, quote, a home freezer, simulating the condition under which it had been preserved for so many years, end quote. The AMNH's only frozen mammoth to date, Effie never did come to rival the Brontosaurus. After the temporary exhibit Nature's Deep Freeze came down, Effie sat in its freezer behind the scenes and visible only to employees of the museum until the 1990s, when it came to occupy its current position, lying at the foot of a reconstructed mammoth skeleton. The present into which the hydraulic dredges of the Fairbanks Exploration Company transposed Effie marked the onset of the Great Acceleration, those decades of unrivaled widespread growth, expansion, and consumption that followed World War II, and from which we have perhaps only recently emerged. Whatever our commitments, or lack thereof, to the current contested epoch of the human, the so-called Anthropocene, this moment was undoubtedly an inflection point in human history, and perhaps likely in the history of our planet, hastening, accelerating the processes of climate change, habitat bifurcation, and biodiversity loss that we are witnessing all around us. And accelerating as well the rate at which frozen remains of Pleistocene creatures emerge from the circumpolar north. Nor is this exclusively or even primarily an American or Alaskan story. As historians have demonstrated, Stalin's notorious 5-year plans brought the Great Acceleration to Siberia, radically transforming and industrializing parts of it. Increased human population and increased human industry, even before climate change began melting the permafrost at such a rate, dramatically altered how often frozen mammoths, rhinos, horses, and bison were found and collected in the second half of the 20th century. And the methods by which these creatures are found, as well as the kinds of time they make, likewise continue to evolve. Still a byproduct of mining, the bodies of Pleistocene-era wolves, lions, bears, mammoths, rhinos, and more are now often found through the efforts of Siberian ivory miners. As the looming extinction of African elephants and international bans on the trade in fresh ivory stem its flow from Africa, demand for fossil ivory has grown, particularly fossil ivory from Siberia. Whereas in the past, the local ivory economy focused on easy to collect surface ivory, especially along the shores of the Arctic Ocean, contemporary ivory miners now tunnel deep into the earth, or more deep into the earth, to obtain tusks, a single pair of which can be valued as high as $1 million. Not infrequently, these mines expose the whole bodies of permafrost-preserved Pleistocene animals. Effie's arrival in 1948, then, is no coincidence. The emergence of a 27,000-year-old creature at the outset of the Great Acceleration marks not only the formal cooperation between mining companies and museums, relationships which persist in various forms to this day, but the intensification of industry in the North that made possible its excavation and the excavation of others like it. No longer subject to the ravages of exposure and scavengers, as the Adams mammoth and other 19th century finds had been, 20th century and more recent frozen mammoths are subject instead to the sharp cleavages of large-scale equipment, as the loss of Effie's back half indicates. These Pleistocene-era time travelers have become, through their finding Anthropocene, arriving ever more frequently. So if the Adams mammoth emerged into a moment at which the deep time of the planet was under construction, and Effie and her mid-20th century contemporaries emerged into a dawning Anthropocene, the frozen mammoths of the 21st century arrive into a present moment that reaches towards an imagined future capable of transcending the wreckage of our current climate crisis. A favorite among de-extinction prognosticators like George Church and Stuart Brand, today these creatures are increasingly invoked as material for the not so eventual reconstitution of their own lost species and the world in which they lived. Mammoths are the proposed keystone of the intertwined projects of de-extinction and paleoecological restoration. Their soft tissues, from their DNA to their stomach contents, are crucial to these new imaginings. Aided by the gene editing technology CRISPR, scientists are working to produce hybrid mammoth elephants by splicing pieces of the woolly mammoth's genome into that of the Asian elephant. While the plant matter lodged between their teeth sometimes, and found in their intestines more commonly, furnish material for fine-tuning the design of the mammoth step that Siberian scientific futurists Nikita and Sergei Zimov are already at work reconstructing. The stated goal of the Pleistocene Park project is to reverse climate change by, quote, slowing the melting of the Arctic permafrost and preventing a catastrophic global warming feedback loop, end quote, which sounds pretty good. But the image of Pleistocene parks populated by Lazarus-like mammoths, appealing though it may be, is a problematic one. Cultural geographer Charlotte Wrigley has explored some of the inconsistencies that mark the Pleistocene Park project, including the irony that it is melting permafrost that exposes the woolly mammoth, the very species whose resurrection is meant to halt global warming in the Arctic, in such great numbers in the 21st century. De-extinction and the resurrection of the mammoth carry ethical implications too, that are at odds with recent scholarship calling for new approaches to wildlife management at a moment of mass extinction, and ethics of care that Juno Salazar Pereñas calls hospice for her dying planet. Such an ethic acknowledges the incalculable losses that we and the life forms all around us are experiencing, without inflicting further harm upon remnant species and individuals in the name of conservation. We might then consider alternatives to the promise of resurrected mammoths, however enticing the prospect of woolly giants prowling the north may be. Zur, the Pleistocene wolf pup discovered by a gold miner in the Canadian Yukon in 2016, offers just such an instructive counterpoint. Shortly after paleontologists identified the remains as Pleistocene era, elders of the Trondet Gwich'in First Nation participated in a blessing ceremony, naming the pup Zur, which means wolf in the Han language, and ensuring that it would be handled by experts, quote, not just as an artifact, but respected spiritually, in the words of Debbie Nagano, who's the director of heritage for the Trondet Gwich'in. The results of preliminary analyses recently published in Current Biology indicate that Zur, a female pup who died at 7 weeks old when the den in which she was sleeping collapsed some 57,000 years ago, is genetically unrelated to contemporary gray wolves in the Yukon. The more than human multi-species peopling, so to speak, of North America via Beringia during the last glacial maximum was more complex than we have hitherto been able to imagine. As an emissary from that past bearing scientific insight, and with her spiritual, cultural, and material ties to the Trondet Gwich'in First Nation, excuse me, Zur's reception in our present reminds us, too, that making time is an ongoing, open-ended process. Futures are not foregone conclusions, any more than are the multiple, complex pasts of our planet and the life it bears. Let us hope that frozen mammoths and their Pleistocene brethren lead us into a more compassionate time to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that wonderful talk. That was very fascinating. Yeah, and I think it's giving everyone a lot to think about here. And so, as I mentioned at the start of start of the talk here, you can post comments if you'd like in the YouTube chat and the chat function of the YouTube channel. And perhaps just because I understand there is a bit of a delay, perhaps the workshop participants who are on Zoom here, if you have any questions, now might be a good time to ask them as well.
I have a basic question to start. This is Karen. I'm just really curious what the idea is, how a Pleistocene park would would stop melting permafrost.
And we're not getting your audio, Rebecca.
How about now?
Yes.
Sorry. I was just starting to say that I'm not a paleoecologist, so this this explanation won't satisfy like the technically inclined, but it has to do with the interaction between the atmosphere and permafrost and the way that permafrost stores so much plant matter in a state of suspension, right? In a state of suspended animation. So when permafrost starts to melt, it activates a lot of bacteria that begin to digest, and that creates that kind of like contributes to the production of carbon. So the idea is that if you can, halt that, it'll slow the rate of carbon emissions. And I think that the role that the mammoth is supposed to play is in like knocking down trees. So the Zimovs, as has been reported pretty widely, use tanks right now in the absence of mammoths to knock down bigger trees in order to create a grassland, because the whole like kind of like comprehensive ecology relies on that type of grassland.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Perhaps I'll ask a question as well here. I was just wondering, you had mentioned earlier about Indigenous testimony kind of as a sign of authenticity in terms of mammoth searching here. So I was just wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on the role of Indigenous peoples in terms of the discovery of mammoths, and I guess within the kind of the broader science around mammoth ecologies as well.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and there's a ton to say there. I mean, if we were to take that question with respect to Siberia, there's a really complex kind of set of cultural beliefs around mammoths that is common to many different indigenous groups living in Siberia, which has to do with like what the heck they are. As is well known in Western Europe in the early modern period, the bones of mammoths and other like extinct proboscidea were assumed to be giant bones, because the permafrost does occasionally like kind of belch out, so to speak. Or I mean, that's like not exactly. It was often through eroding riverbanks that these like the frozen carcasses would emerge, and because people never saw like big hairy animals like this, often the trunk was decayed, so they just looked like kind of like big hairy tusked animal walking around. The explanation was that they were large kind of mouse, like gigantic mice that burrowed underground, and when they came in contact with the air, they were supposed to die, which is a really logical explanation. And in addition, kind of indigenous labor is really important here, because just as today it's local ivory miners who tend to find these bodies, Shumakov, who found the Adams mammoth, was like cruising the shore of the Arctic Ocean looking for tusks, and that's why he was like so keen to get these tusks. In Alaska, or in the Alaska-Yukon borderlands, it plays out a little bit differently. And here I'm working off of archival research that I've done at the Smithsonian and the AMNH for mammoth hunting expeditions that took place in the early years of the 20th century. And there, what would happen is it was kind of like one commentator around this time, maybe in the 1890s, like called it a game of bush telegraph, where, somebody in a bar would report that he had heard from, because it was almost always a he, had heard from an indigenous person, usually described as a quote unquote old Indian, that there was this like creature encased in ice. And then that would make sometimes through the university system in the coast, Alaska, and the University of Washington in Seattle, would make it back to these Eastern museums, where they would get all excited and send an expedition. And inevitably, those stories were very distorted. But it's really interesting because like they wouldn't send a collector to Fairbanks on the word of a European, an ethnic European visitor or newcomer to Alaska. Having somebody who could claim to have been brought there by an Indigenous person really kind of added to the value of the narrative. And again, labor is really important. So one of the Smithsonian, the U.S. National Museum sent a collector in 1905 or 1906, and his expedition failed completely because he had been expecting to be able to hire Indigenous people to guide him and carry his stuff and pilot the canoe. And there was an epidemic. I think it was influenza. I'm not sure. It might have been smallpox. That meant that like nobody in the community whom he had been expecting to work with was available to help him. And he found like some bones and not much else.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, that is fascinating. Thank you. So we do have some questions coming in from YouTube as well. So one question from Megan Carrier asked would the entire aspect of reintroducing past species mess with the ecosystem of the North in a more negative than positive way?
I mean, I would tend to say yes, but I wouldn't say that from that's my kind of instinct as a skeptic, not because I have, deep ecological training, but I do think that, what this, the very least, what this attention to de-extinction with respect to the mammoth does is like, it can distract from, the impending extinction of current species. I think that perhaps there's a qualification to be made there. Muskox were around in the Pleistocene era. So it's not as though at some point in the deep time past, these species didn't interact with one another. But, it's not clear to me that this is like a good road forward. I think that, and like I said in the talk, Charlotte Wrigley, who's a cultural geographer, has done a lot more work on this specific aspect of the story of frozen mammoths. But what, like the kind of likelihood of being able to, that's a project on such a humongous scale as well, that it's unlikely. I mean, I guess that like George Church and Stuart Brand would probably poo-poo naysayers like myself, but it seems unlikely to me that that such a project would be successful or even feasible.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, no, that's very interesting as well. Thank you. So we have another question here on YouTube from Aaron Spinney. Fascinating talk. Can you talk more about the nationalism / national competition / national prestige of discovering Pleistocene mammoths and other animals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's something I really only scratched the surface of. There's so much wonderful work on the history of paleontology and American nationalism. Paul Simonon, who I mentioned, also Lucas Riopel's recent book, Assembling the Dinosaur, looks at the Brontosaurus, which was only kind of reconstructed and unveiled to the public in 1905. So very shortly before the AMNH was like really eager to send somebody to Alaska to look for their own frozen mammoth. I think that it's important to note that that the kind of nationalistic stakes of these kinds of creatures change dramatically over time. So around the time of Thomas Jefferson, who was, more or less a contemporary of Georges Cuvier, as is well known, Jefferson was like really invested in arguments about the size of North American fauna, because Buffon, who was a predecessor to Cuvier as like the kind of most prominent French naturalist in the 18th century, had had claimed that the Americas were nothing but a degenerated version of Europe, right? That they were like not as virile, not as vibrant as European fauna and flora, and this was intended to extend to people as well. So for Jefferson, like the size of American monsters at that time, there was little distinction understood between, actually no distinction really understood between mammoths and mastodons. Cuvier was the first person to reconstruct the skeleton of a mammoth, albeit from like different pieces found in different places in the 1790s. And then around the early 20th century, my sense is that it has to do in part with kind of institutional, a sense of institutional self, like the AMNH wants to be sort of the best museum. And that's partly why it pursues the mammoth. I think, again, it has to do with a kind of like racialized vision of America. It's not accidental that when the AMNH sent a collector to Alaska in 1907, 1908, pursuing a report of a frozen mammoth, Madison Grant, the infamous American eugenicist and racist, was his local host. He was like the person who brought him to Fairbanks and kind of like set him on his way, or actually I think it was to Nome. And then of course, like in the, part of, I think what makes Effie, what made Effie so celebrated at the moment that it was found was that this is like the outset of the Cold War. And so going into the 20th century, into the Cold War period, there will be like very, intensive, a kind of intensive nationalism between Soviet and American scientific institutions, of which the kind of frozen mammoth plays a small role. The Beresovka mammoth was just such an unprecedented, it was precedented by the Adams mammoth, as I said in the talk, but it was so unusually well preserved that really nothing rivaled it until much, much later in the century. And it was it is considered a kind of gem of the St. Petersburg Zoological Museum.
Thank you, Rebecca. And so we have another question from YouTube here. So this is from Jeff Blackadder. From Jeff Blackadder. A very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you, Professor Woods. Would mammoths and contemporary humans still benefit for modifications to the landscape, such as opening migration routes and grasslands?
Sorry, was that for like the contemporary period or for like the Pleistocene?
Might be for the Pleistocene. It's in contemporary humans, so perhaps.
So if we were to talk about like the Pleistocene Park, as I said earlier, I think that the climate future of the Arctic is unlikely to be a mammoth steppe. This is not news to the roundtable or to today's workshop participants. The rate at which the Arctic is warming is so much faster than other parts of the planet. As for like what was happening with human animal migrations in the Pleistocene, I would just defer that to Bathsheba DeMuth, who will be speaking in the next hour, who's written a book about Beringia and the people and animals that have inhabited it over time. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So just looking at and there was a confirmation that it was in reference to the Pleistocene period.
The Pleistocene,
here.
Yeah. I mean, I like that. Maybe Bathsheba will take that up in the context of the roundtable.
Okay, that sounds great. And so just looking at the questions on YouTube, we don't have any new.
Glenn, I can. While you're looking, I have a question.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's okay. Rebecca, thanks a lot for that. That was really good. I also really enjoyed the images that you included in your presentation. So I have a whole bunch of questions. So I'm trying to think of which one I want to ask. This might be a really specific question. So totally, like, it might be too specific. But like in my own research, I've come across lots of newspaper announcements in local newspapers like the Dawson Daily News from sort of like the first decade of the 1900s that announce like the discovery of different bones and tusks and whatnot. And I found it really interesting when you were talking about this sort of connection between mining and uncovering these specimens. So I'm curious if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about that. Like, so I'm like, was there ever a time, and I feel like I probably know the answer, but was there ever a time that maybe the possibility of finding more specimens like preceded the importance of mining in the Yukon-Alaska area, or did they really work hand in hand with each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I think it depends on who you asked, right? Like if you asked, Henry Fairfield Osborne, who was the director of the AMNH and who wrote like, a bunch of books about extinct proboscidea, he might think that fossils took precedent over mining. But the fact is that, even the kind of board of directors who financed these expeditions to Alaska were like invested in mining in Alaska, Madison Grant being an example that I already mentioned. So they're really, really symbiotic. This is the kind of thrust of Lucas Riopel's excellent book on the dinosaur, but I don't think it's any different for mammalian fossils. And it's so, I think that, if we want to like try to understand why it is that, that we have so many more frozen mammoths now, or frozen Pleistocene era animal bodies today than we had, than had been collected circa 1800. It's a big part of it is climate change and the melting of the permafrost. A big part of it is human activity in the Arctic. And so much of that human activity is resource extraction. So, these are a resource of a sort. They have a commercial value, they have exchange value, but they're really secondary to mining. One thing that was really interesting in, I don't have the exact citation to hand, but in the 1930s or 40s in the AMNH's magazine, which was called Natural History, there is an article about that's like kind of celebrating the arrival of strip mining to Alaska, calling it a geologist's dream because it literally strips the surface away and like reveals the geologic history of the place. And that was, really striking to my 21st century sensibilities, where we, at the very least, we understand that there are trade-offs, right? There are costs to this kind, ecological costs. That would be like a really kind of positive perspective, I think, on open pit mining, large scale strip mining. On the other hand, like, we know that they are also extremely damaging to the environment, but this was like a boon for collectors.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. And so perhaps you have time for one more question here. And I notice there's one more question on YouTube here from Joanna Dean. So she says these are have to be the ultimate charismatic megafauna. We have statues of a family of them outside the Museum of Nature. So did Effie disappear for a while because she was not charismatic?
Sorry, could you say the last part again?
Joanna Dean is asking if Effie disappeared for a while because she was not charismatic.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, I think that certainly she's less charismatic than the Beresovka mammoth. I actually don't know if Effie is an it because most of Effie was lost, and it's called, and this goes Heather just asked, the name Effie comes from Fairbanks Exploration Co. FE. Effie, although it sounds like a kind of feminine diminutive. yeah, I mean, what part of what's interesting about that is that that Effie becomes much less charismatic over time. You know, looking at the pictures from 1948, before she shipped, before it's shipped, as they get it ready to put it on temporary display, it's like a kind of plump. There's like more to it than the picture that I took in 2018, where you can see that the specimen has deteriorated. It has become kind of like drier, more desiccated. I think, I mean, I guess like to answer Joanna's question, you know, maybe yes, right? Like it's definitely, you can't, you know, how many, is it going to be, it's not the kind of draw that, that Matthews, for example, had hoped for in 1907. It's sort of more curious. It's more of a kind of, yeah, like, I mean, almost literally a footnote to the skeleton. It's positioned at the feet of a reconstructed skeleton that's massive. That's kind of like the main event in that particular room of the Hall of Mammals currently. And Effie sits there like a footnote. Yeah, thanks for that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rebecca. Yeah, I'd like to thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was very fascinating. It can be kind of awkward, I realize, kind of finishing a presentation that's virtual, but without the applause. But I'm clapping. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fantastic. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so I guess in terms of the workshop, we're going to take about a 5-minute break before Heather. I think Heather Green is picking things up for the next part of the workshop, for the roundtable. Does that sound right? Or?
Yeah, I think we're just maybe like 3 to 4 minute break just to let our speakers get some water, and if viewers want to like stretch or take a break, and then we'll get started in about like 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thanks, Glenn.
Okay, so hopefully everyone is back from the break. We're going to get started on the roundtable. But first, I just want to acknowledge, like John did at the opening remarks, that I'm coming to this workshop from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is located in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nation. Just like Glenn had announced in the first half of this workshop, throughout the presentation and the roundtable discussion, if anyone has questions for any of our speakers, you can also leave those in the YouTube chat and we'll make sure they get to the speakers. So the way that we're going to approach the roundtable is that I think I'll just introduce each speaker as they're about to present rather than everybody at once. And I also just want to send a big thanks to all of the speakers that we're going to hear from today in the roundtable. They've had to endure many different variations of this workshop, so we're really happy that everyone is here and made it all the way to the end with us. So I think we're going to start with Dr. Bathsheba DeMuth. Dr. DeMuth is an assistant professor of history and environment and society at Brown University, where she specializes in lands and seas of the North American and Russian Arctic. Her first book, Floating Coast, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait, examines capitalist and socialist attempts to transform northern oceans, terrestrial habitats, and indigenous peoples, and was named one of the best books of 2019 by both NPR and Nature. Dr. DeMuth's writing on energy, animals, and environmental change has appeared in publications from the American Historical Review to the New Yorker, and she's currently writing about borders and non-human rights along the Yukon River watershed. So I'll pass it over to Dr. DeMuth.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'm going to take just a moment here to share my screen. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. And it's a real pleasure to be joining you this afternoon. Thank you to Heather and Sean and Glenn and to the other organizers, and to Rebecca for that wonderful keynote, which brought me back to a very memorable beer, or many beers, that I had with Nikita Zimov, who is the mind behind Pleistocene Park in Moscow some years ago. And it's a real pleasure to join all of you out there in virtual lands today. I'm beaming in from the unceded territories of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples in what is now Rhode Island. And what I'm going to talk about very briefly today, so I feel like prefacing this with a lot of disclaimers about how much flattening of historical and cultural and geographical particularity I'm about to engage in. But I'm going to talk about a part of the world that's quite far away from where I am now, but is close to where some of you are, which is along the Yukon River watershed in what is now Alaska and Canada. And I'm going to take this time to talk about the relationship between people and dogs along this watershed for the last, basically in the 19th century. We'll keep it at that. And I'm going to be using a lot of quite egregious dog imagery, not to make analytic points, but because it's 2021, we're far into a pandemic, and who doesn't need to look at some dogs on a Friday afternoon? And looking at pictures of dogs helps to make the point that if you're trying to travel along the Yukon watershed prior to the easy availability of snow machines and airplanes, sled dogs are really critical animals to that project. They were critical to movement along the Yukon long before the arrival of Europeans, and in ways that were quite different and distinct between different cultures that live along the Yukon watershed. So along the coast and the mouth of the Yukon, Norton Sound, Inupiaq and Yupik communities used dogs to pull sleds. Usually they worked with just a few dogs in kind of formations like this, in kinds of co-work, often where people were pulling alongside their dogs. Families usually had one or two sled dogs, and not enough to pull sleds on their own. And people very rarely would ride on the sled. Children or perhaps people who were sick would, but generally speaking, co-work between people and dogs was done very directly and in kind of an intimate way. Inland, in the Dene communities from Koyukon country up into Gwich'in land, People also worked with dogs, and there was a long tradition of humans and dogs working together, but not to pull sleds. Generally speaking, dogs were used to carry packs, to help with hunting, for some kinds of guard activities, again, in ways that were very emotionally close to the people that they worked with. And that's kind of what I'm going to emphasize for the moment, is the ways in which in both of these kind of indigenous modes of working with dogs, dogs were recognized as critical parts of the community. They were usually known as individuals. You can talk to folks now who have memories going way, way back of particular dogs and their names and their attributes and attitudes and strengths, and sometimes their weaknesses or, you know, bad habits like eating their harnesses. But the co-working relationship between humans and dogs was very much one forged around having an affective bond at the core. In roughly the 1830s, the Russian and the British empires meet along the Yukon River, and they are themselves trying to do a particular kind of work with dogs. And that is, they're trying to make borders with dogs. They're trying to police the edges of their empires. And they do so by trying to rearrange indigenous borderlands as had existed prior to their arrival. And in order to do this, they too need to be able to have access to and work well with canines. The ways in which both the Russian and the British emissaries, the members of the Russian American Company who come over from Siberia, and primarily the representatives of the Hudson's Bay Company, who are kind of the fringe edge of the British Empire in what is now Yukon, had very different traditions of working with dogs when they arrived along the Yukon watershed. The Russian emissaries had mostly learned how to work with dogs on Kamchatka, the peninsula in the Pacific Ocean, from indigenous Siberians. And the tradition of dog mushing there relied on the use of long strings of dogs, something that is familiar to those of you who live in the north, with lead dogs who were trained to respond to voice direction from people. So if you're used to the jihad commands of the contemporary day, there were Russian versions of these, and often actually indigenous words were used because those were the primary trainers. But the expectation of these dog teams was that people would stand or sit on the dog sleds while the dogs did most of the work. The British Empire, in some ways similarly to the Russian Empire, by the time it arrives in the Yukon, has moved all the way across what is now Canada. And in the course of this, has also learned particular ways of mushing or working with dogs. And again, these are mostly ways of dog work that are picked up from indigenous societies and kind of changed as they move westward across Canada. And in the British case, also having dogs that are trained to respond to left, right, stop, go commands are considered the sort of state-of-the-art mushing team. So both the Russians and the British bring these ideas of dogs that will listen to people without directly working with them in harness the way that Inupiaq would mush with their dogs, with a great deal of agency really left to the dogs as to whether or not they listen. And this is where I'm going to get to affect. If you've ever worked with a dog in your life in any way, you know that a substantial kind of or core piece of the relationship between human beings and their dogs is worked out via affiliation, right? It's easier to work with a dog who knows you well, with whom you have kind of created a relationship of consistency and trust. And this has been borne out now in a really quite vast array of behavioral studies about the relationships between people and dogs, some of which indicate that dogs are so interested in having an emotional relationship with people that they will often choose gestures of kind of warmth, things like petting, over feeding, even amongst dogs who are in stray populations or maybe have less consistent food access. So the desire for dogs to create an affective bond with people is very strong. And obviously for many people, the desire to have a kind of continued ongoing rapport with dogs is also fairly strong. And this has to do with the kind of long coevolutionary history between canids and human beings, which goes back, many thousands of years, so many thousands, there's a lot of debate about. But what this means in the case of these imperial projects that I'm starting to look at along the Yukon is that if you want to ask a dog to turn right or left, you need to have a fairly consistent, good relationship with those lead dogs. Some lead dogs will listen to strangers, but if you're in difficult conditions, if your dogs are tired, if you're trying to get your dogs to not chase a moose and instead listen to what you're doing, the chances of that working well, the chances of your being able to reliably move through space with a dog team are greatly enhanced by having dogs that know the people that they're working with. And this is a thing that I knew because I learned to mush actually along the Yukon borderlands. And it was very clear to me from those instances how critical having a sort of strong affiliation between the lead dogs and the musher is. And it's not something that you can shortcut your way to. So I was quite fascinated when I started looking at the imperial archives for both the Russian Empire and the Hudson's Bay Company, that the two empires have very different experiences of border making with dogs. The Russian Empire, as some of you probably know, has consistent difficulty staffing its posts in Alaska. It's not a prime place to be assigned. If you're a young Russian officer or functionary of any kind, because it's incredibly far away and it's a difficult place, there's an enormous amount of turnover, particularly in the Yukon River posts. As a result of this, the Russian Empire, and particularly the people writing back from Nulato and St. Michael's, consistently talk about the ways in which they have trouble working with dogs. They're frustrated because they have young, unexperienced officers coming in who don't know how to work with the dogs won't listen to them. And this ends up actually being a fairly substantial issue for their capacity to participate effectively in the fur trade and to maintain their bordered space. They don't have enough dogs. They don't have enough people who are trained to work well with dogs. And this ends up being quite different than the British experience, largely because of a couple of particular individuals who end up spending most of their lives at posts, Peel River Post, La Pierre House, and Fort Yukon, who have kind of a more consistent relationship, both with the dogs in those places and with Gwich'in communities who end up picking up mushing with voice commands and turning it into kind of a really vital part of their own cultural practices. So there's a pool of mushers who are, already working with dogs on their own and already able to kind of provide that level of expertise if new people come into the Hudson's Bay Company. All of this, and I will wrap things up here, makes me quite interested in the ways in which, when we're studying human-animal relationships along these borderlands, there's of course a very material and physical dimension to it, in that the number of dogs and what the breed is and where they came from, all of this matters a great deal. But it also matters the kind of emotional or affective relationships between people and animals, or at least people in this particular kind of domesticated animal, end up being really consequential in the creation and maintenance of certain kinds of borders. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Bathsheba. Next up, we have Dr. Karen Rutledge, and Karen has a PhD in history from Rutgers University, and she's a historian for Parks Canada. She lives in Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory on the traditional territory of the Tan-Quitchin Council and the Kwanlin Dun First Nation. She works mostly on exhibits and collaborative research projects with Parks Canada staff and Indigenous communities across Northern Canada. And she's especially interested in the psychological aspects of environmental history. So things like how environments shape people's thoughts and behavior and vice versa. Her first book, Do You See Ice? Inuit and Americans at Home and Away, was published in 2018 and examines the experiences of Inuit and Americans in each other's homeland.
Thanks, Heather. I'll just go ahead and share my screen here. Great. Okay, so yeah, here's a different kind of dog. And yeah, I'm still seeing Heather, but I'm going to start talking and assume that it's okay. So, Zenyu Shokwetan, ING Karen, Uye, Kwanlin NiCHE. I'm honored to live in Whitehorse, which, as Heather said, is on the traditional territories of the Ta'anquichin Council and the Kwanlin Dun First Nation. So this is a really preliminary presentation today, and I welcome any feedback or suggestions. Like Bathsheba, the area that I'll be talking about is the Yukon River. There. But I'm going to talk about it mostly in a different season. So the Yukon River has many names around Whitehorse. One name for it is Tagasho. From the river's headwaters near here, it winds and flows all the way to the Bering Sea. And it's a life-giving force, and it's a place where animals and people have encountered each other since the earliest times. In 1898, tens of thousands of gold seekers used this river to converge on the Klondike gold fields, roughly where the blue star is. And the Klondike Gold Rush has often been celebrated in my settler culture, but it was a devastating and upending event for Indigenous peoples in the region. Most of the gold seekers soon left, but mining continued. For 50 years after the gold rush, the river remained the main summer transportation route. A fleet of stern wheelers, like this one, brought supplies in, took gold and ore out, and moved people and animals around the region. So when I was invited to be part of this workshop about animal history, the first thing I thought of was all the photos I've seen of animals on riverboats. So the question that I want to consider is there anything to be gained by thinking about animals and human-animal encounters from the point of view of moving on the river? And I'll share a few animal stories before returning to this question. First, caribou. This is one of many, many photos that I've seen that look almost identical of caribou swimming, taken from a riverboat. And Fred Young, who worked on the boats for 45 years, recalled that at times the boats have had to tie up and wait to get through, as the caribou would get run over and get into the paddle wheel, and also the rudders and the steerage way. It was more or less unbelievable, caribou in every direction as far as we could see. But he concluded, in the last few years I was on the river, that would have been the late 1940s, we seldom saw a caribou. Fred also commented on just how thrilled many passengers were to see these caribou. And I think to many tourists, the caribou appeared to be something separate, these creatures from another world that were briefly crossing into their own. But riverboats and caribou were all part of the same world. The reasons for the decline of this herd are complicated and disputed, but the mining economy that was made possible by the riverboats is almost certainly part of the reason. The herd stopped crossing the Yukon River at 40 Mile for more than 50 years until they returned in 2002. The next example is about livestock. Over the years, tens of thousands of live cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, and other animals came into the mining regions by boat. It was generally a one-way trip for these animals, a grueling experience that ended with slaughter in Dawson or Fairbanks. Most of these animals would never have seen a caribou, but their lives were still intertwined. When more meat started coming in from outside, demand for caribou meat went down in the mining camps. And the last animal I'm going to talk about is horses. Industrial mining required a lot of horses, although they did switch somewhat to trucks in later years and cat trains, but horses still remain important. This is the yearly pile of ore stacked in Mayo, waiting for the river to break up so that the riverboats can take it away. And you can see from this why so many ads in the newspaper in this period are for teamsters and freighters. Some horses even worked directly for the boats. They moved endless cords of wood to the places where the wood-burning riverboat stopped to fuel up, and one boat had its own horse crew member with its own stall on board. So for me, one thing the river helps me think about is motion and stillness. The riverboats could only run 4 or 5 months of the year because the river freezes. But when you can travel by water here, the river moves fast. And motion and stillness have always been part of animal and human life here, but after the gold rush, the movements change. the river starts humming with both up and downstream traffic, but there are quiet zones along the river where all the forests are cut down and places that for decades stopped ringing with the beat of thousands of caribou hoofs. Indigenous people incorporate the riverboats into their travel and hunting, but their movements are also limited by the Canadian and American states, as well as the new border that bisected the river and some families in half. I ended up not talking about the border too much today just for time, but all of these animals are crossing it. And ironically, the American horses who are sent in 1910 to work on the boundary survey have to cross that border twice before they could survey it, because that's how the geography works. But in short, I think that thinking with the river allows us to think about how human-animal relationships change in space and over time. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Karen. So next up, we have Andreas Wummelsdorf, who is a PhD student in social anthropology at the University of Vienna. He holds an undergraduate degree in geography and social anthropology from the University of Munster in Germany in the fields of geography and social anthropology, and a graduate degree in anthropology and philosophy from Heidelberg University, also in Germany. His PhD research focuses on fisheries management in the Yukon River borderlands and its relation to the emergence of the settler colonial state. His research interests range from the politics of computer games to the position of non-human entities in Euro-American political thought and histories of colonization.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me and can follow the my short PowerPoint slides. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this workshop and my colleagues, and of course our audience, for this rather unique possibility of briefly presenting some of the problems that currently occupy my thought and my research, especially in light of the pandemic. I consider it a great privilege and honor to participate in the inaugural David Neufeld lecture by digital means, because I'm actually living in Mainz in Germany. So I'm talking to you from the other side of the Atlantic. In my research project, I have tentatively entitled Managing a River, Law, Territory, and the Uncertainties of Nature in the Alaska-Yukon Borderlands. I would like to engage with the histories and the geographies of the Yukon River salmon fisheries management regime, a management apparatus that appears to be rather unique in its outline and, of course, in the challenges that the Yukon River salmon peoples face. More specifically, I am interested in the processes and the conflicts by which the river has emerged as a unified object of knowledge and governance. This map, for instance, produced among others by the Yukon Salmon Subcommittee in Canada, is depicting the Yukon River drainage in its entirety, highlighting levels of altitude, mountain ranges, ponds, lakes, and the winding waterways of the rivers. Most significantly, however, the map downplays, almost negates, the significance of the international boundary separating the United States from Canada. The map stresses the futility of boundary lines that have been established by Euro-American settlers throughout the course of colonial history in face of the annual migration of salmon along this vast network of rivers and lakes, rapids and swamps. Salmon, no borders. The Yukon Salmon Subcommittee's depiction of the Yukon River drainage as an eco-political zone of contest and instability reminds at least a bit of the cartographic representation of Frederick Swatka's exploration of the Yukon River in 1883, an undertaking that aimed at drawing a line from the Yukon River's supposed source to its mouth. In their depiction of the river as an interconnected system of waterways in which the international boundary is clearly articulated as of minor eco-political importance, these maps stand in stark contrast to another map, a map of the Yukon River, or so-called Yukon River statistical areas, produced by the Department of Fish and Game of the state of Alaska. Here, the integrity of the river seems of subordinate importance, as the Yukon River appears disrupted by the graphic articulation of different yet interrelated numbered management zones. Also, the international boundary, the territorial limit of the DFNG's jurisdiction, seems far more articulate, as it stands out in the far right side of the map. In my research project, which I have to admit has almost entirely stopped because of the pandemic, I would like to address three sets of interrelated questions in order to understand how various articulations of the Yukon River, all of them essentially political, relate to one another, very much like these three maps stemming, of course, from almost entirely different historical and instrumental contexts. The first question, what are the historical conditions that allow for this unified object of knowledge and governance, the Yukon River, to emerge? How did the Yukon River become both a label for a territorial government, the Yukon Territory, and the name for a system of interconnected waterways? How has the river been perceived by Euro-American settlers, missionaries, explorers, river captains, etc., and how do these perceptions relate or translate to technologies of governmental control or management? Some of these things have already been touched by Bathsheba's talk and by Karen's previous talk. To what extent do Euro-American articulations of the Yukon River differ from indigenous voices, and with what consequences? How are the juridico-political frameworks of the river's salmon fisheries specifically related to articulations of both the river's integrity and its modularization, and to what extent are these very same settler colonial apparatuses conditioned by phenomena such as the annual migration of salmon that undercut colonial geopolitical divisions of land, peoples, fish, and other non-human beings? Well, after this very, very brief introduction of my research, I would like to thank you, my audience, very, very much for your attention, your interest, and your wisdom. Masicho. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Next up, we have Dr. Philip White. Phil is an instructor of history and Northern Studies at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He recently completed his doctoral dissertation in history titled Arctic Artery, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and the World It Made. He teaches and researches the history of Alaska, the circumpolar north, and US-Canada energy relations. Before focusing on Northern history, he published 2 separate book chapters, the first on the countercultural roots of green consumerism, and the second on how pipelines transformed the Great Plains into an energy heartland. His public history works have appeared in forums such as Yale Environment 360, Anchorage Daily News, and on NiCHE, and he lives in Fairbanks, Alaska.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather. And good afternoon. I want to thank the organizers for convening this exciting conference. And it's my pleasure to be here with all of you today. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene people here in around Fairbanks, Alaska. Give me just a moment here and I'll share my screen. Excellent. I want to offer 2 provocations when thinking about northern borderlands and animal history. The first is that scholars should consider the tools and lens of energy history as a productive method to analyze the organic energy regime of animals and the mineral energy regimes, which so often eroded and reordered biotic environments. I came to this conclusion when studying the global environmental impact of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, or TAPS. The realization of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System in the mid-1970s precipitated nothing less than the industrialization of the North American Arctic. The advent of TAPS changed the economics of North American hydrocarbon extraction and ushered in a new era of high energy society in the far north. Fundamentally, Arctic oil development pitted a new mineral energy economy against the ancestral organic energy economy of First Peoples, namely whales and caribou. The pipeline reorganized terra aqueous ecologies and energy flows, transforming not just the tundra, but also the Beaufort Sea and distant aquatic environments that transcended political boundaries. And I think we see this absolutely true in the other workshop participation, workshop convener discussions that we've just had. This industrialization directly threatened bowhead whales, caribou, and flows of animal energy, the lifeblood of Inuit, Inupiaq, and Gwich'in peoples for millennia. Yet this was not a black and white struggle, pro versus anti-oil. It was a struggle for indigenous sovereignty and what one indigenous leader called native life on native terms. These contestations created new multinational indigenous and state responses to the management of these borderlands and their energetic bounties. And as I'm sure you are all aware, these contestations are alive and well today, most notably in the fight over the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Second, I argue scholars need to look at the less obvious, less seen borderlands. We need to follow the long arms of energy infrastructures and the flow of their commodities to understand their full impacts on animals and ecosystems. Again, the example of TAPS is instructive. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, contrary to popular imagination, was conceived, constructed, and operated as a terra aqueous infrastructure, a hybrid pipeline tanker system. And here I draw some inspiration from Daniel Immerwahr's recent book, How to Hide an Empire. So we were told the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System is this terrestrial conduit from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, but far more accurately, it is a global hydrocarbon system that is, transcends Alaska, transcends its narrow terrestrial boundaries. And the inauguration of this system also went hand in hand with the construction of 50 new tanker vessels, the largest civilian tanker building program in US history. And so the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System's tankers were afforded far less diligence, oversight, and scrutiny than the terrestrial pipeline, right? Everybody was happy to, journalists were happy to write stories with the iconography of constructing the pipeline in the rugged Alaskan landscapes, but they tended to not write about the tankers. And so and ultimately this contributed to a kind of regulatory neglect. The regulatory neglect of the tankers mirrored their narrative neglect. The tankers of TAPS directly led to the devastating Exxon Valdez oil spill, whose impacts endure to this day, from depleting herring populations to the functionally extinct AT1 orcapod of Prince William Sound. The tankers also affected aquatic environments in nations far from Alaska. On June 7th, 1980, the TAPS tanker, Texaco, Connecticut, struck the rocky shoreline of the Charges River in Panama and leaked 230 gallons of Alaska North Slope crude. The Arctic oil contaminated the tropical ecosystems of Lamam Bay and Gatun Lake, including the shoreline of the 4,000-acre Smithsonian Institution's biological preserve. The carcasses of dead fish and birds washed ashore for days. And it's worth noting that basically no major newspaper covered this spill. Finally, I should mention a TAPS tanker that spilled over 1 million gallons of Alaska North Slope crude into the North Pacific, but hardly anyone knows about. In January 1987, after being battered by a relentless 3-day storm, the stress of the ocean ripped a 17-foot crack in the single-walled supertanker Stuyvesant as it sailed through the Gulf of Alaska. 600,000 gallons of Arctic crude seeped into the North Pacific. A series on another occasion in October of that year, after the tanker had been repaired, a series of 50-foot waves fractured the Stuyvesant's hull and disgorged an additional 700,000 gallons into the ecosystems of the North Pacific. These spills received little attention since currents carried the toxic crude westward into an aqueous area far removed from human coastal communities. Yet since TAPS oil leaked far from population centers and the coast, the ecological effects of these spills went unseen and unknown by Homo sapiens. This crude did untold damage to fish and marine mammals, but we will very likely never know its true toll. In conclusion, in thinking about northern borderlands, we need to pay close attention to organic and mineral energy regimes, as well as to how northern commodities flow to southern metropoles, and impact environments far beyond the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And our last speaker today is Oscar Hartman Davies. He's a PhD student at the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford. And he's a cultural and environmental geographer with a particular interest in how environmental sensing practices influence environmental politics and management. His PhD project looks at the material practices associated with canary in the coal mine discourses in the Arctic and what these reveal about the politics of authority and legitimacy in environmental decision-making, with a particular focus on the Hudson Bay. He holds a BA in geography and an MSc in environmental governance and co-runs a grassroots conservation organization in the UK.
Thanks very much, Heather. Wait, let me turn my camera on. And thanks to you all for fascinating presentations, and to the organizers for having me here to speak with you all. Like Andy, I'm coming to you from the other side of the Atlantic here in the UK, and also from a fairly tumultuous time in my PhD research. So whilst I'm now going in a slightly different direction from my earlier focus on Hudson Bay, for which you'll hopefully forgive me my lack of slides or much in the way of empirical material to discuss with you, I'll speak a bit about where my research was going before dwelling on some of the conceptual interests that emerged there that I'm carrying through into what I'm now working on after taking some time off from the PhD, namely sentinel territories and species, particularly seabirds, environmental sensing technologies like animal body-mounted GPS tracking and data logging devices, and a more general focus on the ways in which resource economies and resource politics intersect with environmental monitoring practices in the Arctic. So the poles and the kind of human and more than humans that inhabit them are increasingly positioned as sentinels and assumed either in their entirety or parts to yield crucial signals or warnings about planetary or regional futures. And references to sentinels and canaries in the coal mine are multiplying across the natural sciences and the public domain. As with the canary, whose heightened sensitivity to toxic gases and death in their presence warn miners to vacate mine shafts, sentinels signal emergent conditions that would otherwise go unnoticed until their effects were more pronounced. Now, reading the non-human world for advanced signals of change is not a novel practice, of course. What is new, however, I argue, is the present articulation of sentinels and sentinel devices and territories, alongside particular environmental sensing technologies that facilitate ways of registering and interpreting signals from the world and kind of manifestations of sentinels that might not have been possible before. So the growing use of these sentinels in part reflects the excessiveness of contemporary environmental and human health threats to immediate perception. And sentinels express in particular ways the imbrication of environmental sensing practices with emerging ways of knowing and governing in a plural, complex, and contingent world more broadly. But despite the growing use and significance of sentinels, the signals that they're held to transmit are often quite ambiguous or contested. And furthermore, even in instances where agreement is reached, as anthropologists Keck and Larkoff say, quote, the sentinel is bound up with the question of whether the detection of danger can successfully ward off a coming crisis, end quote. So my research was initially looking at Hudson Bay and the case of the eider duck. So I'll speak a little bit about that before moving on to some of the questions that I'm still looking at that are to do with that research and speaking a little bit about where I'm going. So Hudson Bay, as many of you will likely know, is a large inland sea in northeastern Canada supplied by currents from the Arctic Ocean, which make it unusually cold compared to other areas of the same latitude. And it's often referred to as the most southerly Arctic marine ecosystem in the world. And common eider ducks are well-known residents of Hudson Bay, and they're large sea ducks found widely across the Arctic and subarctic. And most populations migrate seasonally in search of feeding grounds and open water. But the Hudson Bay population is unique in that it remains, it's endemic to the bay, and they resolutely stay put within the bay year round, and they're reliant on these areas of water called polynyas that remain ice-free throughout the year and where they feed. And they congregate in these polynyas in such numbers that Inuit have sometimes likened the sound of flocks taking off to approaching thunder. And there are stories of hunters being frozen solid by the water raining down from their wings when they take off. In the winter of 1991, several thousand eiders around the Belcher Islands near the community of Sanikiluwak became trapped and died in the ice when these polynyas froze over. And this event is, I won't go into it in too much detail, but it's bound up in a politics around the Nelson and La Grande River hydroelectric projects and the impacts that those have on the kind of freshwater marine coupling in the bay and the way that the currents work and how this affects the formation of these polynyas. So what I'm taking now that the field work that was associated with that hasn't really materialized, and I'm moving into a direction that focuses a little bit more, is partly desk-based and focuses a little bit more on the European Arctic, and I'm hoping to organize a field trip to Tromsø in northern Norway to look at a seabird monitoring program up there called CPOP, run by NINA, the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. But more generally, I'm still interested in how discursively and in practice, particular animals and other non-human things and processes, like those pertaining to sea ice and currents, are designated as indicators or sentinels of environmental change by different epistemic communities. And then to look at the work that sentinels do in practice and the ways in which more than human beings are mobilized and participate in disputes relating to environmental change and Arctic environmental politics. And so thirdly, I'm interested in exploring the politics and expertise of legitimacy associated with sentinels, and querying these material discursive formations as particular expressions of who gets to speak for the environment and how in Arctic environmental governance. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Oscar. And thank you to everybody who presented on our roundtable today. If I could just make sure all of our roundtable panelists are here, maybe if you could turn your cameras back on. We have a few questions that came in from the audience, but I want to start with a few of the questions that the organizers have been thinking about a little bit throughout the whole time that we've been organizing this workshop, and also some questions that came up directly from your presentations themselves. So maybe the first question that I'll pose, and all of you feel free to answer this or any of the other questions really, is one of the themes that we as the organizers kept coming back to as we started to plan out this workshop, was the ways that lived experience in the North offers a different perspective from some of the borderland scholarship coming from studies south of the 49th parallel. And so I'm curious, from your research and from your experience working in the North, what do you think a Northern perspective has to offer to the fields of borderland studies? I know it's a pretty big question. So, you know, it might take a minute to sort of think, but I think a lot of you made some really good calls to action in your research, and you've each sort of focused on certain arguments that you're making or claims that you think we need to spend more time looking at how certain approaches to history might work in the North. And so, you know, I think that some of those calls to new ways of thinking about research might be a way that we can think about how a perspective coming from the North has something new to say about borderlands.
Heather, I can give that a shot, just some preliminary thoughts here. For me, and this is maybe a bit ironic since I'm sitting here in interior Alaska, but for me, it is all about the importance of aquatic environments. And when we look at the North, understanding how much, how much maritime ecosystems impact the entire far north. From an environmental perspective, the rich biology of aquatic ecosystems and how that filters into terrestrial landscapes. I think from my presentation, thinking about and this goes to Karen's presentation as well, thinking of waterways as transit corridors that move commodities that affect animal ecosystems, not only throughout the circumpolar north, but on a north-south axis. And maybe the last thing to think about that is some of that aquatic environment is, the importance of that can be highlighted just when we think about the difference between the Arctic and the Antarctic, right? The fact that the Arctic is this ocean surrounded by continents, and the dynamics of that aquatic environment remains extremely important for the entire far north.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Does anybody else have thoughts on this? Do you want to maybe expand on what Phil says, or different opinions on what the North has to offer from your own research?
This is not related to my talk today, but I would also just add the way that ice itself in the north can function almost as land at certain times of the year. Makes a difference in connecting places.
Yeah, that's interesting, Karen, too. And I wonder if, and maybe this, like you said, it's not directly related to what you presented on today, but maybe just your sort of broader experience. How have you seen some examples of ice? How does it interact with these ideas about boundaries? Does it sort of work against some of the ideas that we have established of what a boundary might mean?
Yeah, I mean, this is not my area of specialty. There are quite a few books, including the co-authored publication by Sherry Gearhart that's all about ice. But my sense is just that it certainly blurs the boundary between what is water and what is land. And ice, I mean, especially before motorboats, ice is much, much easier to travel on than water with dog teams, as Bathsheba was talking about. So during the winter is really when people can move between areas that are disconnected by water in the summertime.
I think also one of the things that's interesting about looking at borderlands in the north is that they unfold in a place that, generally speaking, is hostile to the kinds of settler colonial agricultural incursions that so mark borderland scholarship very importantly and for very good reason. Both on the southwest border in the United States and the borderland scholarship that just deals with the westward move of US empire and Canadian empire, and thinking about the ways in which states and individuals think about themselves coming into places that are not going to have amber waves of grain, actually refracts back on some of those ideological assumptions in ways that are useful and can sort of build out the scholarship on borderlands more generally.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it sort of it leads into one of the other maybe major framing questions that we've had in the back of our mind throughout the planning of this workshop as well. And so the question I'm about to ask, it comes sort of through what you guys have all presented today in your topic. So you all spoke about the roles that non-human animals have played in the creation of borders in the north. So in some cases in this history, we see examples of animals crossing borders, but we also see examples of borders crossing animals. And given the significance or the centrality of animals to your research, I wonder if you could maybe speak to how you have engaged with the past lives of animals in your research and why animals are significant to the studies that you're doing.
Well, one thing I would like to add in regard of Bathsheba's previous comment, one of the things that I found so very interesting in regard of northern borderlands is that although they are kind of barred against the imposition of an agricultural epistemology, it is still legally in place. Like salmon, for instance, are still treated as crops, migrating over territories and borders. And this is always posing, this is constantly posing threats to, on the one hand, to people that are actually relying on the resource, on the other hand, to the epistemological framework itself. Like it's constantly, like the uncertainties of managing salmon and managing salmon according to like, I don't know, managing a crop on a farm is constantly undercutting the legitimacy and the applicability of the whole legal and management apparatus itself. And this is something I found extremely particular when it comes to northern borderlands, where oftentimes borders are, or where a legal definition of a border creates fascinating disruptions that can come up, that can extend into places and practices that one would not expect. And on the other hand, but it can also be ignored like right away because of the police coverage and all of this. But like in Mainz, I'm like every weekend I'm traveling to the Limes, to the border that was separating the Roman Empire from the non-Roman lands, and I'm always wondering about these structures that are lying around, like walls and castles, and there was a heavily militarized zones, all of like everywhere were roads. Mainz was a huge camp for the legionnaires, and this heavy militarization and infrastructurization is something that or that cannot be, that is very particular to southern borderlands, I would guess, in a way. Okay, that's probably.
Yeah, just before anyone else wants to jump in, either on that or on the second question, I really, I really agree with what you said there about the legal definition of what boundaries mean also leads to disruptions. And I think that's something when we think about the lived experience of the North, that we see quite often. And like you say, in some ways, in the history of the North, and perhaps in the present as well, sometimes those legal definitions of borders are easily ignored, which I think is really interesting as well. Did anyone have anything that they wanted to jump in on the second part, like to sort of think about the way, maybe the methodological approach, or how you've come across animals in the archives? How has your approach to animals in your research topic been, and what's the significance of centering animals in your studies?
I could jump in with something there. I mean, I don't necessarily do that much archival research, but Bathsheba, I thought your attention to the key role that affective relations between humans and animals play to this kind of a reliable, effective and functional relationship when it comes to dog mushing. I think that brings up some interesting questions. And I think attending to animals and human-animal relationships, at least in the context of what I'm looking at with sentinels, I think is really important, because I suppose it shows some of what's at stake in reimagining the Arctic as this kind of bellwether of environmental change, which I think tends to sort of flatten out the geographical and historical and local specificities of place and human-animal relations and these kind of affective relations. And yeah, I think kind of attending to the animal and human-animal relations brings that back into focus in a way that kind of is challenging to that erasure.
I was interested by your question, Heather, because I in thinking about why I've written quite a bit about animals in the North, I realize it's because I can't imagine telling Northern histories without them. They are so central in the archives. They're central in the archives because in places where you're not getting the majority of your calories from plants, they're just sort of critical to human life, both for Indigenous folks and for settlers for a long time. and because of some of these places where the kind of affective relationship is emerging, which is a thing I've only started paying attention to recently. But I think it says something that I hadn't even thought about it, because it seemed so impossible to try to write a history that didn't actually think about those relationships quite fundamentally.
Yeah, I think I think that's a good point. And one of the things that we were thinking about as we were planning this too, it sort of goes back to the idea about lived experiences. All of us, as we were sort of talking about our own research, realized like what a big role animals did play. And for me in particular, like my research, I wouldn't ever claim that I do animal studies or animal history, but animals are such a huge part of the experience of the North. I'm also curious, maybe, and this links back to Rebecca's talk. I wonder if anyone has thoughts on perhaps the ways that studying animals more robustly, I guess, than maybe focusing so much on humans, has that allowed you to think about borders in ways that take us away from the like Anthropocene? Like, are we, or like an anthropogenic approach to thinking about borders? If we focus more on animals, do we see maybe a different history than if we focus on human border making?
I would like to say something to this, because it's difficult to give a definite answer, of course, but I think from my experience, I think so. Like what I find so interesting when it comes to human the role of animals in border studies is that at the moment, my impression is that the significance is extremely it's basically downplayed, kind of, and especially the way in which animals create disruptions in the way in which borderlands are operating, or are supposed to operate, at least from a state level. And this is one thing that I find so interesting. They're creating constant tensions between different bureaucratic agencies, different decision-making processes, etc.
Yeah, what about other folks in their work? Like, do you see maybe different ways of thinking about how animals might shape borders, even if it means in the decisions that humans make about where a border should go? Like, do animals have a role to play in that? Or if not borders, like what role do animals have to disrupt, like Andy's been talking about as well, like in your own studies, in the local setting that you're working in, do we see examples of borders being shaped around either, animals contributing to the decision-making of borders, or animals leading to the disruption of those borders?
I think in research that I've done, particularly on the border between the United States and Russia as it comes to exist after the Second World War, there's a way in which animal populations, and particularly migratory animal populations, force a recognition of borders fictions that is frequently quite distressing to the nation states that have to deal with it. But the idea that you can make all of the decisions that you need to make within your national territory is often undone. And you can think, a case on the US-Canada border with the porcupine caribou herd and its fate really resting on the US presidential election, over which many people who depend on that caribou herd have no political voice in a direct sense, is another instance of this. But sometimes I think they have created spaces of cooperation across really quite profound ideological difference that wouldn't otherwise be open, because there is no other way to manage Pacific walruses than to manage them as border species. For example, my dog wants dinner, so if you hear the yowling in the background, there is a dog participating in this conference.
If no one else has anything to jump in on that particular question, maybe I'll move on to just one more question from me directly, and then I'll move on to some of those that have come in on YouTube. So one of the things that I find really interesting, and in a sense, like this virtual setting highlights the different places where we're all coming from in thinking about borders in the North. So for a lot of us here participating in the workshop, you know, we're based in the South, but writing about the North or working in the North, or we're on a different continent, completely thinking about the North. But other of us here are living in the North or are Northern residents and have grown up in that environment. And so, you know, I'm really curious to hear from each of you about your experience as researchers in the North, and whether the idea or the labels of insiders and outsiders have played a role either in the approach that you take to your research or the way that you frame your work. Like, you know, whether in this sort of, in a sense, like it speaks to borders in a different way, but how you maybe identify yourself as a researcher in that region. Has it shaped the approach you take to the North, or has it shaped the way that you frame your work?
I guess I can start because I've been both. I started my career with Parks Canada working in Calgary, and then I moved up to Whitehorse, and that was my choice because I felt that I could do my job much better from here. And I can say that, you know, people have always been really kind to me when I was coming and going, and because I do work with parks and sites across the North, I still go to places where I am definitely an outsider. But just spending a lot of time in a place has really mattered. It matters for relationships. It matters just to understand more about the place that I'm writing about. But I mean, that being said, it's not, you know, a lot of us have to live in the South. That's just the reality of it. And so I think all of you, like everybody here that I know, has been really has still found ways to spend extended time in the North, and I think that's what matters most.
Yeah, I would echo what Karen said. So even though I'm, you know, coming to you all from the North, from Fairbanks, you know, I consider myself, you know, an outsider in this environment, and certainly took some guidance from Bashiba's book, talking about, you know, herself as a foreigner in these landscapes coming to this place. And so I think it very much matters to be in the North and to spend time here, and that has fundamentally changed my disposition about how I think about and how I write Northern history. And yet I still, you know, because of where I grew up, because of the cultural baggage that I bring, and because of the first peoples who have made this their land for millennia, still consider myself an outsider. And rather than resolving that kind of maybe a bit of a dilemma, somebody might consider it, I really see that as a productive tension. And it helps me think about the ways in which the North has been transformed by these Southern imperial forces over time, and how that continues to happen in real time today.
Yeah, I would echo both what Phil and Karen said. I am living in the relative South, essentially because of employment, right? Academics don't get to choose where they live for the most part. And I'm very lucky to work at an institution that supports me to go back north when it's not a pandemic quite frequently, so that I am able to maintain some of those connections. But I have felt increasingly over this last year, when I have been sort of physically disconnected from being able to get north, the need to really plan my future around sabbaticals that are spent completely on the ground. Like as soon as I have a year off, we pack the car and we drive across the continent. Because I think that those kinds of long-term relationships at some point do become difficult to sustain from afar. I also think, like Phil, that there is a way in which I see my work as a historian whose kind of purview is the far north, is that it works in concert with and hopefully alleviates pressure on some indigenous historians who are doing work within their own communities. I think of my role as being explaining the patrimony from which I come and what it has done to these places. And then in fact, I am responsible for that, because these are the ideas that come from the part of the world that I was raised in and have been exported. And hopefully that they create space for a really rich and far more textured set of histories about the North than any one person can ever write. We need a lot of us doing this work. So hopefully, even when we're consigned to Rhode Island for years at a time because of a pandemic, there is still space for that.
Oscar and Andy, did you want to add anything there? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, at least I want to stress, to echo what Bathsheba, Phil, and Karen have already said. I mean, for me, like being grounded now in Germany for more than a year is tough, and it's extremely difficult to maintain long-term relationships, and I'm missing to be back, and but it's there always, it's like employment, family circumstances. There are so many different things that always have to be accounted for. So but I definitely want to stress what my previous colleagues have said already.
Great. So I'm just looking at the time. We have about 5 minutes before we are going to wrap it up. We're a little bit over what we originally had scheduled. So we have 2 audience questions in particular. One is applicable to anybody, and one is specifically for Bathsheba. So maybe I'll go with the one that's for everyone. Whoever wants to answer, feel free. And then if we have time, we'll get to that more specific question. So this question comes from Megan Carrier. And she asks, because most of the projects are within the American-Canadian border, do you notice a difference in how each country interacts with archives or communities with oral histories?
It's a good question, but I haven't done enough work in Alaska to be able to answer that.
Yeah, I guess, to really fully, like, you would have to, I was thinking this as well, that, even though a lot of these topics are border focused, like we still tend to spend a little more time on one side than maybe on the other. So it's a little difficult to compare, but it is a really great question, if you have that scope to be able to think about that. So then I think maybe I'll move on to the question directly for Bathsheba. So this comes from Nancy Langston, and it's sort of a 2-part question. So the first is, how do you think the dogs themselves might have shaped different human-dog relationships along the border? And then the second is, if we follow ideas of Ed Russell, might different choices regarding dog or sled technologies change the dogs themselves?
Thank you, Nancy, for those questions. And in longer versions of this project, there very much are instances where you can see dogs shaping the relationships they had with people. both just in terms of which dogs move where, and because dogs make certain kind of emotive demands on people. I know you know this as somebody who also has pit bulls at home, that there's a way in which you can think about these Borderlands projects as being subject to a kind of affective discipline that comes from the dogs themselves. Like if you're going to be successful, you're going to need to do things on dog terms, at least part of the time. So I think that that's the case. Also, the differences between human-dog kind of working relationships were part of how people recognized cultural distinctions between each other, in situations of great familiarity with those differences, like between Inuit and Gwich'in folks, but also, as Europeans are moving into territories that they don't understand at all, one of the things that they're able to pick up on is the fact that Dene communities work with dogs differently than Inupiaq communities do. In terms of the kind of different kinds of dogs, one of the things that really fascinates me about this kind of canine borderland is that for the first kind of century of European presence in the Yukon, the genetic decisions that go into making dogs are basically made by the dogs themselves. There's not a great deal of deliberate breeding going on, often to the great despair of the Europeans who think of, keeping canine reproductive choices under human control as a sign of civilization. It's a sign of full domestication, right? If you are in charge of that. But for sort of various reasons in various kinds of colonial situations, it's usually the dogs making these choices. And this is explosively the case during the gold rush, when huge numbers of dogs are brought in, mostly from San Francisco and Seattle, and all different kinds. So people hear that dogs are useful in the gold fields, and they show up with, everything under the sun, lots of St. Bernards and Newfoundlands, lots of dogs that are fairly inappropriate for northern climates. And of course, these dogs arrive and proceed to make all different kinds of puppies. And so it's out of this mixture, which for quite a while is not one that is being directed by people, but is being directed by canine choices, you get the kinds of working huskies as opposed to purebred Siberians that are sled dogs now. And I think in some ways, the origins of dog racing and the kind of competitive form that it shows up in Alaska is a result of these canine choices, because people start to see that there is a differential ability for speed or for pulling weight because the dogs behave differently, they look differently. And then at that point in the early 20th century, dogs really sort of come under full human jurisdiction. There's a way in which sovereignty in a nation state sense actually looks a lot like sovereignty over dog bodies as the 20th century kind of gets going.
Great, thank you, Bathsheba. So I think we'll wrap up. We have about 2 minutes. So maybe before we leave, I just want to, of course, thank all of the panelists for your great presentations and for the ideas that we sort of new ideas to think about as we move forward with Borderlands work and research. And I also, of course, want to thank my fellow organizers, Glenn and John, and Sean and NiCHE for helping us set up this, the whole virtual workshop. And a thank you to Karen as well for coming on board with the Neufeld lecture. And a thank you to David Neufeld's daughter, Erin, who was also on our organizing committee for the Neufeld lecture. And so, yeah, so before we leave, the organizers will touch base with all of you with, a follow-up email. And other than that, just thanks a lot for being here and for sticking with us all through this.
Mm-hmm.